The break-in happened on a Tuesday night when the Millbrook Public Library was supposed to be empty. 3 men in black masks had bypassed the security system and were searching through the computer files when they encountered Margaret Sullivan, the 58-year-old head librarian who had stayed late to finish inventory. They expected to find a frightened woman who would cooperate with their demands for access to the library's database. What they found instead was someone who assessed their entry method, identified their likely objectives, and neutralized all 3 threats in under 90 seconds without making a sound. Because Margaret Sullivan hadn't just spent 27 years learning how to keep libraries quiet, she'd spent 20 years before that learning how to keep secrets that could topple governments. This is the story of how a quiet Tuesday evening would expose one of the most extraordinary double lives in American intelligence history, and how sometimes the most dangerous people in the world are hiding behind the most innocent facades. Margaret Sullivan glanced at the clock on her computer screen. 9:47 p.m. The Millbrook Public Library had been closed for nearly 2 hours, but she had stayed behind to finish the quarterly inventory that was due to the county administration by Friday. At 58, Margaret had developed a routine that served her well. Arrive early, stay late, and maintain the kind of meticulous organization that made the library run like clockwork. She moved through the stacks with practiced efficiency, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floors. Each book was in its proper place, each section organized according to the Dewey Decimal System that had become second nature to her over nearly 3 decades of library work. The building was completely silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning system and the occasional settling creak of the old structure. Margaret preferred working alone in the evening. No interruptions from patrons, no phone calls, just the peaceful solitude that had drawn her to library work in the first place. What she didn't know was that 3 men had been watching the library for the past week, studying the patterns of staff arrival and departure, noting the security system's vulnerabilities, and waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Margaret was in the reference section, updating the inventory database on her tablet, when she heard the first sound that didn't belong. A soft metallic click from the direction of the main entrance, followed by the barely audible whisper of the front door opening. Her fingers paused over the tablet screen. In 27 years of working at the library, Margaret had never heard that particular sequence of sounds. The front door was supposed to be locked, and the security system should have triggered an alarm if anyone had entered without the proper code, but there had been no alarm. Margaret set down her tablet and listened carefully. 3 sets of footsteps, moving with deliberate caution across the main floor, not the sound of someone who belonged in the building after hours. Old instincts, dormant for decades, began to surface. Margaret's breathing automatically regulated itself. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly as she moved toward the end of the reference stacks, positioning herself where she could observe the main floor while remaining hidden. Through the gaps between books, she could see 3 figures dressed in dark clothing, their faces concealed behind black masks. They moved with professional efficiency toward the circulation desk where the main computer terminals were located. Margaret's mind automatically began analyzing the situation. Entry method, sophisticated, bypassing both locks and alarm system. Objective, access to computer databases. Personnel, 3 individuals, moving with coordination that suggested training. Threat level, unknown, but the masks indicated they weren't planning to leave witnesses. For the first time in 23 years, Margaret Sullivan allowed herself to think like a CIA operative instead of a librarian. The 3 men worked quickly once they reached the circulation desk. The first, apparently the team leader, pulled out a small electronic device and connected it to the main computer terminal. The second man positioned himself as a lookout near the front entrance, while the third began searching through the desk drawers. "How long do you need?" the lookout whispered to the man at the computer. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. The encryption is more sophisticated than we expected. Margaret remained perfectly still, observing from behind the reference stacks. These weren't random burglars looking for petty cash or electronics. They were after information, and they had come prepared with specialized equipment. The question was what information could possibly be valuable enough to justify breaking into a small-town public library. "Got it?" the computer specialist said quietly. "I'm in the main database, searching for the Sullivan files now." Margaret's blood turned to ice. They weren't here for random information. They were here for her. The man at the computer continued typing. There's a lot of data here. Personnel records, library usage logs, computer access history. Wait, here's something interesting. Look at these research requests from the past 6 months. Margaret knew exactly what they were looking at. For the past year, she had been using the library's computer system to conduct research that had nothing to do with books or patron services. She had been carefully tracking information about her former CIA colleagues, trying to determine which of them might still be active in the field. Because 6 months ago, Margaret had received information that suggested someone from her old unit had been compromised, someone who knew about operations that should have been buried permanently. "This is it," the team leader said. "She's been using library resources to investigate classified personnel." The boss was right. She never really retired. Margaret's mind raced through her options. 3 armed intruders. Unknown capabilities. Looking for information that could compromise not just her own safety but the safety of operatives who were still in the field. The smart move would be to remain hidden, let them take what they wanted, and deal with the consequences later. But Margaret had never been one to choose the smart move over the right move. She began moving silently through the stacks, using the library's layout to her advantage. 27 years of working in this building had given her an intimate knowledge of every sightline, every blind spot, every route that would allow her to move undetected. The skills she had learned in her CIA training, observation, stealth, tactical assessment, had translated surprisingly well to library work. The same attention to detail that made her an effective operative had made her an exceptional librarian. Now those skills were about to converge in a way she had never expected. Margaret approached the circulation area from the side, using the tall stacks to conceal her movement. The 3 intruders were focused on the computer screen, their attention completely absorbed by the data they were extracting. She was within 15 feet of them when the lookout finally sensed her presence and turned around. "Hey," he called out, reaching for something inside his jacket. "We've got company." What happened next occurred with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory developed over decades of training and reinforced by years of life or death situations. Margaret moved forward in a smooth, fluid motion that seemed deceptively slow but covered ground with surprising speed. Her left hand deflected the lookout's reaching arm, while her right delivered a precise strike to a pressure point at the base of his neck. The man dropped unconsciously to the floor without making another sound. The team leader spun away from the computer, pulling out a pistol, but Margaret was already moving. She used a nearby book cart as partial cover, while closing the distance between them. Her approach was angled to prevent him from getting a clear shot while positioning her to disarm him efficiently. The weapon was out of his hands and across the floor before he fully processed what was happening. A follow-up strike to his solar plexus doubled him over, and a precisely applied hold cut off blood flow to his brain long enough for him to lose consciousness. The third man, still sitting at the computer, raised his hands immediately. Wait, don't hurt me." Margaret approached him slowly, her movements calm and controlled. "Hands where I can see them. Move away from the computer." The man complied, sliding his chair back from the terminal. "Look, lady, we're just here for information. Nobody needs to get hurt." "That was your decision to make 15 minutes ago," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a tone of authority that the quiet librarian had never used. "Now you're going to tell me who sent you and what exactly you were looking for." "I don't know what you're talking about. We're just..." Margaret picked up the electronic device the team leader had been using and examined it briefly. Military-grade encryption software, definitely not something available to civilian contractors. "This is NSA-level equipment," she said, "which means you're either government operators or you're working for someone with access to government resources. Either way, breaking into a library to steal information about a retired CIA operative suggests this is personal." The man's eyes widened. "Your CIA was 23 years ago, but apparently, someone thinks I'm still active." Margaret pulled out her cell phone. "Now you can tell me who sent you, or you can explain it to federal investigators. Your choice." "Wait." The man held up his hands. Okay. We were hired by a private contractor. Someone who said you had information about a CIA operation from the night Operation Silver Mirror." Margaret felt the familiar chill that came with hearing the name of a mission she had hoped never to think about again. Silver Mirror had been one of the most sensitive operations of her career. A deep penetration mission in Eastern Europe that had resulted in the extraction of a high-value intelligence asset and the elimination of a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on American targets. The operation had been successful, but it had also been completely off the books. No official records, no paper trail, no acknowledgement that it had ever happened. The only people who knew about Silver Mirror were the 6 operatives who had participated in it, and a handful of senior CIA officials who had authorized it. "Who else knows about Silver Mirror?" Margaret asked. "I don't know. We were just told to get access to your research files and download anything related to CIA personnel from the 1990s. Margaret's mind was already working through the implications. Someone with knowledge of a classified operation was trying to identify the participant. That suggested either a security breach at the highest levels of the CIA, or one of her former teammates had been compromised and was being forced to provide information. Either way, it meant that the quiet life she had built as a librarian was about to become very complicated. Margaret zip-tied the 3 intruders using cable ties from the library's supply closet, and called. She gave the dispatcher a brief factual report. 3 men had broken into the library. She had subdued them while defending herself, and she was requesting police response. What she didn't mention was that she had also found a cell phone on the team leader that contained recent calls to a number she recognized. A number that belonged to someone she hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. While waiting for the police to arrive, Margaret used the intruders' own equipment to access the library's security system and review the footage from the past week. The men had been conducting surveillance for several days, photographing staff schedules and testing response times. But more concerning was what she found in their electronic equipment. In addition to the data they had been trying to steal from the library's computers, they had files containing personal information about her former CIA colleagues, home addresses, current employment, family member. Someone was building target packages on retired CIA operatives. Margaret made a decision that she had hoped never to make again. She activated a secure communication protocol that she had maintained, though never used, since leaving the agency. It was a way to contact her former handler in case of emergency. The call was answered on the 2nd ring. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," said a voice she hadn't heard in 23 years. "Hello, Margaret. Hello, Control. We have a problem. I know 3 of our people have gone missing in the past month, all from operations you were involved in during the 1990s. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. "Which operations?" "Silver Mirror, Black Canyon, and Northern Light. Someone is systematically targeting our people, Margaret. And based on what happened tonight, it looks like you're next on the list." Through the library's front windows, Margaret could see police cars pulling into the parking lot, their red and blue lights reflecting off the building's glass facade. "I need extraction," Margaret said quietly. "Not possible. As far as the agency is concerned, you've been a librarian for 27 years. We can't officially acknowledge your service without exposing operations that are still classified." "Then what do you suggest?" "The same thing you've been doing for the past 2 decades. Keep your head down, maintain your cover, and trust that we'll handle the threat from our end." Margaret watched as police officers approached the library entrance. "And if you can't handle it?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Then I guess we'll find out just how much you remember from your operational training." The line went dead. Officer Maria Santos was the first to respond to the break-in call at the Millbrook Public Library. She had been expecting a routine burglary report. Maybe some teenagers looking for computers to steal or homeless individuals seeking shelter for the night. What she found instead was 3 unconscious men zip-tied on the floor and a mild-mannered librarian who seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just been the victim of a crime. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Santos. Are you Margaret Sullivan?" "Yes. I'm the head librarian here. I was working late when these men broke in." Santos looked at the 3 unconscious intruders, then back at the small, soft-spoken woman standing beside them. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened here?" "They broke in through the front door, bypassed the security system somehow. I was in the back doing inventory when I heard them. When I came to investigate, they threatened me, so I defended myself." "You defended yourself against 3 men?" Margaret nodded. I took some self-defense classes a few years ago. I guess the training was better than I thought. Santos knelt beside the first intruder and checked his pulse. Strong and steady, but the man was completely unconscious. What kind of self-defense training was this? Krav Maga, Margaret replied without hesitation. There's a class at the community center on Thursday evenings. It wasn't entirely a lie. Margaret had occasionally attended the Krav Maga classes, though she was careful to hide the fact that she had learned most of the techniques decades earlier in a very different context. Santos examined the second intruder. Ma'am, these men appear to have been subdued by someone with advanced combat training. Are you sure you're telling me everything? Margaret maintained her calm, helpful demeanor. Officer, I'm a librarian. I organize books and help people find information. These men broke into my workplace and threatened me. I did what I had to do to protect myself. The detective who arrived 20 minutes later was less easily satisfied with Margaret's explanation. Detective Raymond Park had been investigating crimes for 15 years, and something about the scene didn't add up. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you some questions about the equipment these men were carrying. Margaret followed Detective Park to a table where evidence bags contained the intruders' electronic devices, weapons and communication equipment. This is military-grade surveillance equipment, Park said. Not the kind of gear you'd expect burglars to have. Do you have any idea why someone would use this level of technology to break into a library? I really couldn't say, Detective. Perhaps they were after the computers? Some of our equipment is fairly new. Park studied Margaret's face carefully. Miss Sullivan, in your work as a librarian, do you have access to sensitive information? Government databases, private records, anything that might be valuable to criminals? Margaret shook her head. Just books, Detective. And the occasional research request from students or local business owners. What about your personal background? Military service, government employment, anything that might make you a target. I've been a librarian for 27 years, Margaret said. Before that, I was a graduate student studying library science. Not exactly a high-risk lifestyle. Detective Park wasn't entirely convinced, but he also didn't have any evidence to contradict Margaret's story. The intruders had been caught in the act of breaking and entering, and Margaret appeared to be the victim of a crime. What he didn't realize was that he was interviewing one of the most accomplished liars in CIA history, someone who had spent 2 decades maintaining cover identities in hostile foreign countries. Over the next 3 days, the Millbrook Police Department's investigation into the library break-in yielded more questions than answers. The 3 intruders had been using false identities. Their fingerprints weren't in any criminal databases, and the sophisticated equipment they had been carrying suggested connections to organized crime or domestic terrorism. Margaret returned to work the following Monday as if nothing had happened. She processed returned books, helped patrons with research requests, and maintained her usual quiet efficiency. But she was also conducting her own investigation using resources that the local police didn't have access to. Late in the evening, after the library closed, Margaret used encrypted communication protocols to contact her network of former CIA colleagues. What she discovered was deeply disturbing. 3 retired operatives from her former unit had disappeared over the past 6 weeks. All had been taken from their homes with no signs of struggle, suggesting they had been approached by people they trusted. All had been involved in operations that should have been buried so deep they were impossible to trace. But someone was tracing them anyway. Margaret's secure phone rang while she was researching personnel files on her home computer. "We found Harrison," said the voice on the other end. It was Control, her former handler at the CIA. "Is he alive?" "Barely. He's in a military hospital in Germany. Someone spent 3 weeks extracting every detail about operations from the 1990s. Silver Mirror, Black Canyon, Northern Light. They know everything." Margaret felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. What does that mean for the rest of us? It means that whoever is behind this has a complete operational picture of our activities from that period. They know who was involved, what the objectives were, and which operations were successful. Do we know who's behind it? We have theories. There's a private military contractor called Meridian Defense that's been recruiting former intelligence operatives. Their client list is classified, But we suspect they're working for foreign governments or criminal organizations that want information about American intelligence operations. Margaret absorbed this information while mentally reviewing everything she knew about Meridian Defense. The name was familiar, but she couldn't quite place where she had heard it before. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Nothing. Maintain your cover as a librarian. We're handling this from the operational end. Control. They came after me at my workplace. They're not going to stop because you ask them nicely. Margaret, you've been out of the field for over 2 decades. This isn't your fight anymore." Margaret looked around her small apartment, at the quiet life she had built after leaving the CIA. Books everywhere, a comfortable reading chair by the window, photographs of library events and retirement parties. It was a good life, a peaceful life, but it was a life that was about to be destroyed if she didn't take action. "Maybe it's not my fight," she said quietly, "but it's my life they're threatening, and my friends they're targeting. Margaret, I'm not asking for permission. Control. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." She hung up the phone and began planning her next move. Margaret Sullivan had spent 27 years as a librarian, but she had spent 20 years before that learning how to gather intelligence, identify threats, and neutralize enemies of the United States. Those skills had been dormant for decades, but they hadn't disappeared. Over the next week, Margaret used her position at the library to conduct research that would have impressed her former CIA colleagues. Using public records, newspaper archives, and legal databases, she began building profiles on Meridian Defense and its key personnel. The company had been founded 5 years earlier by former military and intelligence officers. On the surface, it appeared to be a legitimate private security firm providing protection services to corporations operating in high-risk areas. But Margaret's deeper investigation revealed connections to shell companies, offshore banking, and contracts with organizations that had been linked to foreign intelligence services. Most importantly, she found a connection that made everything click into place. Meridian Defense's senior vice president for intelligence operations was someone Margaret knew personally. David Chen, a former CIA operative who had been terminated from the agency in 1995 for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Chen had been Margaret's partner on Operation Silver Mirror. He was one of only 6 people who had complete knowledge of the mission's details. And according to the personnel file Margaret accessed through her old CIA contacts, Chen had been carrying a grudge against the AG for nearly 3 decades. Margaret now understood what was happening. Chen was using Meridian Defense to systematically target his former colleagues, extracting information about classified operations, and selling it to the highest bidder. The 3 men who had broken into the library had been working for him. But Margaret also realized something else. Chen had made a critical error in judgment. He was operating under the assumption that retired CIA operatives had gone soft during their years in civilian life. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Margaret spent the weekend preparing for a confrontation that she had hoped never to have. She retrieved equipment that had been stored in a safety deposit box for over 2 decades. She reviewed operational protocols that she had memorized but never expected to use again, and she made contact with 2 of her former teammates who were still alive and uncompromised. On Monday morning, Margaret called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. By Tuesday evening, she was on a plane to Washington, D.C. Meridian Defense occupied 3 floors of a modern office building in downtown Washington, D.C. To all appearances, it was a legitimate business operation with corporate offices, conference rooms, and the kind of sterile professional atmosphere common to government contractors. Margaret observed the building for 2 days, noting security procedures, shift changes, and patterns of employee movement. Her surveillance skills had remained sharp despite decades of disuse, and she was able to identify vulnerabilities in Meridian's security protocols. On Thursday evening, Margaret entered the building through a service entrance using credentials she had obtained through methods that would have violated several federal laws if anyone had been monitoring her activities. She made her way to the 15th floor, where Meridian Defense's executive offices were located, moving through the building with the kind of purposeful invisibility that had served her well during her CIA career. David Chen was working late. As Margaret had anticipated, former intelligence operatives were creatures of habit, and Chen had always been someone who preferred to work when the office was empty. Margaret entered his office without knocking. "Hello, David." Chen looked up from his computer. his expression shifting from surprise to recognition to something approaching fear. "Margaret Sullivan, I heard you were a librarian these days." "I am. 27 years of checking out books and organizing community reading programs." Margaret closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Chen's desk. "But before that, I spent 20 years learning how to track down people who betrayed their country. I never betrayed anything. The agency threw me away like garbage after Silver Mirror. You were terminated for selling classified information to foreign contacts. That's the definition of betrayal." Chen leaned back in his chair, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "What do you want, Margaret? I want you to stop targeting my former colleague. I want you to return any information you've extracted from them, and I want you to disappear from my life permanently." "And if I don't?" Margaret smiled, but it wasn't the gentle expression that library patrons were accustomed to seeing. "Then I'll remind you why the CIA recruited me in the first place." Chen reached for something in his desk drawer, but Margaret was faster. Her hand clamped down on his wrist with enough force to make him gasp. "David, you've been running a private security company for 5 years. I've been studying human behavior and information systems for 27 years. Which one of us do you think has stayed sharper?" Chen tried to pull his hand free and discovered that Margaret's grip was considerably stronger than he had expected. "You can't threaten me. I have security. Your security team left 20 minutes ago. I checked." Margaret released his wrist and sat back in her chair. "Now, let's discuss terms." Over the next hour, Margaret and Chen negotiated an agreement that would have impressed professional hostage negotiators. Margaret's terms were simple. Meridian Defense would cease all operations targeting former CIA personnel, return any stolen information, and provide compensation to the operatives who had been kidnapped and tortured. In exchange, Margaret would not provide evidence of Chen's criminal activities to federal prosecutors. "How do I know you won't come after me later?" Chen asked. "Because unlike you, David, I don't hold grudges. I solve problems and move on." Margaret stood to leave. "But if you ever threaten me or my people again, you'll discover that some problems have permanent solutions." 6 months later, Margaret Sullivan was back at the Millbrook Public Library, helping a local high school student research colleges for her senior thesis. The quiet routine of library work had resumed, and to all outward appearances, nothing had changed. But Margaret now maintained certain precautions that she hadn't bothered with before. Her home security system was considerably more sophisticated than necessary for a small-town librarian. Her weekend trips to the community center's Krav Maga classes had become regular, not occasional, and she had re-established communication protocols with former colleagues that would allow for rapid coordination if threats emerged. Most importantly, Margaret had come to terms with something she had been avoiding for 27 years. She could be a librarian and a former CIA operative at the same time. The skills that had made her effective in intelligence work, attention to detail, information analysis, understanding human psychology, were the same skills that made her excellent at helping people find what they needed. The Millbrook Police Department had never solved the mystery of the library break-in. The 3 intruders had been released on bail and subsequently disappeared, their identities still unknown. Detective Park occasionally stopped by the library to ask if Margaret had remembered any additional details about the incident. She never did, but Margaret did make one change to her routine. She began teaching a monthly class at the library called Research and Information Security. Ostensibly, it was designed to help patrons protect their personal information and conduct effective online research. In reality, it was Margaret's way of teaching basic counterintelligence skills to ordinary citizens who might someday need them. The class was always full. On a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year after the break-in, Margaret was reshelving books in the reference section when she noticed a young woman watching her from the computer terminals. The woman approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, Miss Sullivan. I'm a journalism student, and I'm researching a story about private military contractors. I was wondering if you could help me find information about companies that recruit former government employees." Margaret looked at the woman carefully. Young, intelligent, genuinely curious rather than threatening. She reminded Margaret of herself at that age, someone seeking truth in a world full of secrets. "What kind of story are you writing?" Margaret asked. "I'm investigating reports that some private contractors have been targeting retired intelligence operatives. There have been several disappearances that don't seem to be getting proper attention from law enforcement." Margaret considered her response carefully. "That sounds like it could be a very important story. Let me show you some databases that might be helpful for that kind of research." As they walked toward the computer terminals, the young journalist asked, "Ms. Sullivan, have you ever heard of a company called Meridian Defense?" Margaret smiled slightly. "Let's start with publicly available records and see what we can find." Some secrets, she had learned, were meant to be kept. Others were meant to be revealed at exactly the right time, by exactly the right person, to exactly the right audience. Margaret Sullivan had spent 20 years protecting secrets that needed protection, and 27 years afterward maintaining a cover that had become a genuine second life. But now she was ready to use both sets of skills for a new purpose, making sure that the truth found its way to people who could use it responsibly. After all, that's what librarians do best. 2 years later, the Millbrook Public Library had become something unique in the intelligence community. A place where retired operatives could access resources and assistance without compromising their cover identities or triggering official attention. Margaret's research and information security classes had evolved into an informal network of people who understood that information was the most powerful weapon in the modern world, and that knowing how to find, verify, and protect information was essential for anyone who wanted to remain safe and informed. The journalism student who had approached Margaret that Tuesday evening had gone on to publish a series of articles exposing the targeting of retired intelligence operatives by private military contractors. Her reporting had led to congressional investigations and new laws protecting former government employees from harassment and exploitation. Margaret never admitted to being a source for any of the articles, but those who knew her well noticed that she seemed particularly well informed about intelligence community affairs, for someone whose official biography contained only library science and community service. The Millbrook Public Library's collection had also expanded in interesting directions. The reference section now included an unusually comprehensive collection of books on international relations, intelligence history, and information security. Margaret had quietly used her personal connections to acquire documents and publications that weren't available through normal library channels. Patrons who needed help with research on sensitive topics found that Margaret possessed an almost uncanny ability to locate obscure sources and verify questionable information. Her recommendations were always accurate. Her research methods were remarkably sophisticated, and her discretion was absolute. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret had discovered that her two careers, CIA operative and librarian, were not as different as she had once believed. Both required the same fundamental skills: understanding how information moved through systems, knowing where to look for answers that others couldn't find, and maintaining the trust of people who needed help. The only difference was the stakes involved and the methods used to achieve objectives. On quiet evenings when the library was closed and Margaret was working alone, she sometimes reflected on the path that had led her from conducting covert operations in foreign countries to organizing community reading programs in a small American town. She had spent 20 years protecting national security by keeping secrets hidden. She was now spending her retirement protecting individual security by helping people find the information they needed to make informed decisions about their lives. Both forms of service required the same commitment to helping people navigate a dangerous and complicated world. Both required skills that most people took for granted, until they found themselves in situations where information meant the difference between safety and danger. Margaret Sullivan would never write a memoir about her CIA career. She would never accept recognition for operations that were still classified decades after their completion. And she would never break the oath of secrecy that she had taken when she first joined the agency. But every day, as she helped patrons find books, conduct research, and access information that they needed for work, school, or personal decisions, Margaret was continuing the same mission she had always served: protecting people who needed protection, providing assistance to those who requested it, and ensuring that the right information reached the right people at the right time. Sometimes the most important work is done by people whose real qualifications must remain forever hidden. Sometimes the best guardians are the ones who look like they couldn't guard anything more dangerous than overdue library books. And sometimes the quiet woman behind the reference desk is exactly the person you hope is watching over your community when threats emerge from the shadows. Margaret Sullivan had spent 47 years serving her country in two very different capacities. She had learned that real security comes not from weapons or surveillance systems, but from having trustworthy people in positions where they can help when help is needed. The Millbrook Public Library was now one of those positions. And Margaret Sullivan was exactly the right person to fill it. Real security stories, where every hero has a story and every story matters.